Our next conversation is titled You Reap What You Know and will include Tom Van Dyck, Managing Director and Financial Advisor of RBC Wealth Management, Andy Behar, CEO of You Sow, and Melissa Beck, Executive Director of the Educational Foundation of America. Please welcome our next panelists.
Well, just to get you guys, I know everyone keeps saying get your blood flowing a little. If you could stand up, I'm going to ask a couple of questions just so we know, kind of get a sense of who's out here. How many of you vote your proxies? Anybody vote their proxies? All right, we got a few there. How many of you own fossil fuel companies? I still see, oh, people who are standing are voting their proxies. Well, that's good. They're voting on the, and we'll talk about that a little bit later because what As You Sow focuses on is shareholder advocacy. And how many of you have signed the divestment pledge? Okay, we got a lot more hands than yesterday. That's good. And how many of you believe that your returns will be negatively impacted if you were to divest from fossil fuels? Well, good. We don't have a lot of myth believers here. How many of you want to divest, but you don't quite know how? It's kind of still kind of a little mysterious. All right, well, we got one person there. So these are some of the things we're going to be talking about. As I mentioned, one of the things about divesting from fossil fuels and engaging with companies is that investors have a lot of power that they leave on the table. A lot of people abdicate their power, and they don't even realize that they have it. And we're going to talk about what's happened in the 2016 proxy season, where there's been a record number of climate resolutions at both Exxon, Chevron, Anadarko, Hess, all the extraction companies and utilities. Also how the divestment movement plays with that same, plays a major role in creating a power base. And I'm going to hand it off now to Melissa to talk about how Educational Foundation of America has been doing this. They're one of truly the pioneers, leaders in the divesting of fossil fuels.
Thanks so much, Andy. So for those of you who don't know, the Educational Foundation of America is a family foundation. We were launched in 1959, excuse me, and we fund nationally in 3 areas: the environment, reproductive rights, and the arts. We also actually have a new initiative on anti-sex trafficking. So Andy, you're right. We are leaders in this field. And this elephant, I have to give a shout out to John Powers. This is his mastery. Tom, if I click this, my elephant will go into action. This is essentially our philosophy, that we want to make sure that our endowment is aligned with our grant making. So the elephant represents our endowment, our investment portfolio. Are you going to click for me, Tom?
I'm working on it.
Tom's working on it. And that's Tom, who is essentially feeding our elephant, right? Making sure that the foundation can exist in perpetuity.
That's your manager who doesn't use ESG screening.
And who's on the other end of the elephant when your investments are not in alignment with your grant making? Well, your grantees are there, and they're cleaning up after you. And that's not the way EFA wants to operate, and indeed, it's not the way we operate. What do? We work really hard to make sure that our investments are aligned with our grant making and our larger vision and values in the world. So we screen, of course, using ESG screens. We work with Andy at As You Sow to make sure that we're voting our proxies in alignment, again, with our grant making strategies. We make sure our managers understand what our policies and values are so that when they're voting our proxies, they're doing so in alignment. We are original signatories of the Divest Invest Pledge, and reinvesting assets in things that are supporting climate solutions like Tesla, Nest, and Solar City are some of our, might I be so bold to call them, signature moves. This slide represents essentially how we view all of our work with our endowment, again, to make the type of change we're trying to see in the world through our grant making. Tom, could you advance me to my final slide? Now, Andy asked if anyone believed the myth that investing for good means bad returns, and I only saw one hand go up. So now I feel like I don't even need to show this slide because none of us believe that mythology. It's so nice to be in a group, in a room with people who are so enlightened. Usually when I speak on this subject, someone is always asking that question. And one of the things that's exciting about this slide is that it demonstrates that EFA's returns are wonderful and extraordinary. We thank Tom for that, and of course the investment committee of our board, who works very hard to make sure that our assets are invested, again, in line with our core values and getting the returns that we need to keep us going. Thank you, Clara. Woohoo indeed. Over to you, Tom.
Well, thanks, Melissa. And this represents a portfolio that's fully integrated environment, social, and governance factors, using the environment, social, and governance factors to mitigate risk. If I get the next deck up, that'd be great. Mitigate risk and generate outperformance or alpha. Okay, so it's fully fossil fuel free and uses the integration of the environment, social, and governance factors across all elements of the asset allocation. So large cap, small cap, international, emerging markets, fixed income, private equity. So a full portfolio strategy, which is where the movement needs to go to. So on the fossil fuel free side, because you've been hearing from a lot of people, I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. You heard Clara talk about this. Others have talked about this. Owning fossil fuel means owning risk. Where are the risks? Stranded asset risks. We've heard about what that's all about. Paris. Litigation risk. Many of the attorney generals are going after Exxon now for what they knew when. Is it going to follow the arc of tobacco? Probably. Carbon pricing risk. The idea of let's put a price on carbon. Elon Musk talks about it constantly, that it's like allowing the fossil fuel companies to basically continue to burn without a price on carbon is like throwing garbage in the streets expecting someone else to pick it up for you. Remember, in a capitalistic system, pollution is a subsidy. Okay, and if we're for free markets, then we need cost price integration to actually be reflected in a way to get the price of that carbon actually reflected in the price of the product that they are burning. That will happen at some point. Regulatory risk, we heard someone today talk about the idea of the clean power plant. Peak demand versus peak supply, kind of interesting debate. Are we actually at peak demand for power, for oil, or is it peak supply? Technology risk, and this is probably the biggest risk of all facing the fossil fuel companies today, is the idea of technology risk. Why? Here's the price of oil, highly volatile. I don't know if it's going to be at $50 or $25 or at $75. Will it get to 142 again, as we see here back in 2007? I doubt it. But who knows? And so if you are someone who uses oil or gas, this is something that's a problem from the standpoint of pricing. The technology risk, though, is related to clean technology because it's about economics. Look at the drop in solar prices right here. They have dropped over 80% within a decade. It's gone from $3.50 a watt to 40 cents a watt. This is an economic force that's driving the adaptation of why people are putting solar on their houses, because it makes more economic sense to do this. And this is all the externalities priced in, right? When they say coal's at 6 cents a kilowatt, they're not actually taking into account the mountaintop removal, the asthma, any of the other costs involved. That's really about 24 cents a kilowatt hour if they did that. So solar is dropping. And what else is dropping? Wind, 2 cents a kilowatt hour. In California, the two cheapest power sources right now today are solar and wind. You can ask the head of the California Energy Commission. He talks about that publicly. Look at the drop in LED lights. Significant drop in less than a decade, again, $60 to $4. Significant drop in price. Why? Because it's a technology. Okay, it gets cheaper with every single generation. So that's what's leading to adaptation. Battery storage, the main holy grail. Why? Because then you can store this electron. Because what's happening here, and it's the largest wealth generation element in this for our generation right now, is moving from burning a petrochemical molecule to producing an electron to using renewable sources to produce that electron. Once you can store it with a battery, then you don't need fossil fuels anymore. It's game over. Look at the drop in price from 2009 to 2020. When Elon finishes the plant in 2017, 2018, they're looking at a price below $200 a kilowatt hour. When I asked Jim Rogers, who used to run Duke Energy, what price does he need to make battery storage efficient from a utility scale perspective because he says it's too expensive. I said, what price do you need? He said, below $200 a kilowatt hour. It's probably going to go to about 180. And the reason why? The gigaplant. That's a mile long, by the way, the scale. This is going to be the largest plant will produce more lithium-ion batteries than all the plants combined on the planet today. 15 of these around the world will provide enough battery storage so you could actually be off of 100% fossil fuels across the entire world. 15 of them. But we have to finance it and figure out how to make that happen. We need to generate the demand, that Brandon was talking about. Where is that coming from? So if you're a business person and your second cost to labor is electricity, can you go to a natural gas guy and say, hey, can I lock in natural gas for 20 years at a fixed cost right now? They'll say, you crazy? I'm not going to say this stuff at $265. It's going to be higher. If you go to a solar manufacturer and say, can I lock in that cost right now at 4 cents a kilowatt hour? They'll say, absolutely, 20 years. Lock in. So if you're running that as a business person, you can now lock in your costs. Why wouldn't you do that? At 4 cents a kilowatt hour, you can improve your brand, you can lock in your costs, you can actually manage your capital expenditures going forward much more efficiently. Microsoft, Apple, Bloomberg, all these companies are moving towards 100% renewable because it makes economic sense. This is not about politics, this is about science and economics. And that's what's driving the change. And think about this, Apple Computer. I mean, as far as disruption goes, where was Apple 20 years ago? Steve Jobs joined it for $1 and was trading at $11. Where was Kodak? Kodak had the technology to do digital photographs. They owned that property. Did they do anything with it? No, because they wanted to monetize their own outdated technology. And what did Apple do? Apple innovated. Where's Apple today? It's in the Dow. Is Kodak in the Dow? No, but it was 20 years ago. That kind of disruption is what we're looking at taking place across the system. It's the largest wealth generation opportunity that we're going to see. It's going to take place in every single aspect of our economy. Water, $500 billion market. It's going to grow to this. Energy, $750 energy storage, grid optimization. You can read the charts. Transportation, the whole thing that Tesla is doing. The single largest product sale ever was the Model 3. Single largest. They say, oh yeah, but GM has this huge market cap, but they've never sold 300,000 cars in one fell swoop like that. It's not even ready to be bought yet. Think about that. Building, light, insulation, HVAC systems, waste management, waste reduction. We've heard a lot about that here today. Agriculture, we've heard about that. All of these areas of the economy are going to be affected and be made more efficiently through this transition that we're talking about. And that's why capital is shifting this way. It's not doing it to feel good. It's doing it because it makes the most economic sense. Let's fast forward through some of these issues. And does it make economic sense? How many people have heard of the dominant index? Raise your hand. Not many. So this is the screen version of the S&P 500. They eliminated 250 companies of the S&P 500 in 1990 that did not pass environment, social, and governance factors. They said, okay, then they looked at it compared to the S&P, and they said, we need to add another 100 companies in here to make it so that it's statistically close to the S&P so it can be compared. And then they added 50 Ben & Jerry's of the world to the mix. And they adjust it, on an ongoing basis monthly, only based on ESG factors. Very minimal financial criteria. You have to be above $5. You have to make money for at least 8 quarters, and you can't have a debt-to-equity ratio above 75%. That's it on the financial side. All ESG. Went live 1990. It's outperformed the S&P 500 on an actual and risk-adjusted basis. If you put $1 million in this fund, right now you'd have $1 million more than if you just invest in the S&P index. Here's a manager, one of our largest managers. They fully fossil fuel free the whole time, ESG integrated throughout. They embed it in their financial system. Look at the performance numbers. So I know Andy asked the question earlier, how many people here are not fully integrating ESG in their portfolio? And I would say, if you're not doing it, then my question to you is, what is inspiring you to underperform? Thanks.
It's actually a really big question, and it's really it comes down to fiduciary duty of many of the pension funds who are underperforming because they have certain rules where they will not divest from fossil fuels. It's a discussion we have with them all the time. Now, what they say is, we're going to engage with the companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One of the big actions that's been happening now is something called proxy access, which this gives shareholders the right to nominate and run a board candidate. And there is a major move. It's been being led by the New York City Pension Fund. Last year, they filed 75 proxy access resolutions with companies. And as of, I just got an email from Mike Garland, he's been doing it. So 115 companies, now this is just in the last 2 years, 115 companies now have proxy access in their bylaws. That means that if you have a coalition of people with 3% of the company held for 3 years, you can run your own board candidate. Now, simultaneously, all these pension funds, that's $59 trillion worth of assets, are getting together, and they're going to start to knock people off these boards. It's called climate competence. What we're looking for is a climate competent board. A lot of these people have been on these boards forever with absolutely no risk. You're going to see a major shift. You're also going to see the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, is retiring. So a new generation is going to be starting there. A major shift is happening, and shareholders are taking control because the companies are just not responding. Now, I mentioned that this year that there were 8 resolutions, climate resolutions at Exxon. One of them got 41% vote. That was asking Exxon to state publicly what their 2-degree scenario is. So what's your plan? All the shareholders are saying is it's a material disclosure. You must tell us how you are going to not only survive, but thrive in a climate-constrained future. We've all agreed this is going to be a climate-constrained future. Chevron got the same resolution, high votes. One resolution that as You Sow put forward has to do with, we want the companies to define themselves by reporting what their energy, right now they have what are called reserve replacements. So that's the amount of oil and gas they're going to be replacing. Every barrel that they sell, they need to find a new one. We want them to report this in BTUs. That will inspire them to use their CapEx to go after geothermal, to go after all the different things, wind, solar. They have brilliant engineers. These guys know how to drill a hole in the ground, and they can do it, but they're not financially incentivized because their compensation packages are tied to oil. And so we're making the case, if you're going to be an energy company, report in energy units. And we got decent votes on that, but the conversations with the companies is what's interesting, because we actually sit down and meet with them. And they're realizing that the change is happening, and the conversation goes something along the lines of, look, you're either going to transition or you're going to be winding down. Business as usual is off the table. And the people on the inside, the executives, realize that. So there's a real shift that is happening. I could go on and on about resolutions. We also filed with 12 utilities, had a very good breakthrough, I believe, with AEP. So that's, and what we're talking about there is stranded asset risk, but not stranded assets of reserves, but stranded assets of infrastructure. In other words, you got these big coal plants, but there's no more coal coming in. What are you going to do with all this infrastructure? And so there's all kinds of risks embedded in these utilities, in these extraction companies across the board, and investors are going to see it. And the only reason Exxon stock is where it is, which is about $90 right now, is because of massive stock buybacks and also increased dividends. Now, if you look at their debt, they're actually borrowing money, and it's going back out as dividends and as stock buybacks. Well, it's going into CapEx, but the CapEx is, however the money is fungible. But the debt is going up, and yet they aren't really making a profit, and they haven't for about 5 years. So this is a very, it's a house of cards. We're actually publishing a paper in about a month that's going to be talking about the lack of structural integrity of the entire oil industry. So the risk is there. It's huge.
I think that one thing that, actually there's 2 things I'm thinking of, Andy, in listening to you speak. One is for EFA, we, as a fully divested foundation and, very seriously investing in climate solutions, I also mentioned that we vote our proxies actively, And here's Andy talking about all of these energy companies and how can EFA do that. And one of the ways that we do that is to have a sleeve of the portfolio that is an activism portfolio. And I do just want to make that clear because that is a conversation we have with a lot of our foundation colleagues about, are you staying in the game to be an active shareholder, or is there a way to divest and then essentially segregate some stocks so that you can pursue a shareholder strategy, which is something that we do. Andy, I think you should also, it would be beneficial to mention your new tool that you've developed about screening some of the mutual funds, because I do think that's really empowering.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, if you sign a divestment pledge, part of it states that you can hold a certain amount of stock in order to engage with the company.
Right.
We recommend somewhere around $5,000 because you need $2,000, and if you think the stock's going to be go down by 50%, which is what happened with the coal industry. We wrote a very similar paper called The Financial Risks of Investing in Coal back in 2010, very similar to what we're doing with oil right now. And so, again, a lot of risk, but you can avoid the risk and still have the engagement by divesting the majority of it.
And still be effective at making change.
Um,
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, As You Sow owns no stock. We file resolutions. We find shareholders, and they authorize us to file on their behalf. We filed 50 resolutions this year. We don't own one share of stock. So we can be very effective in terms of the negotiation when you get the pension funds, you get all these big stockholders to back your resolution.
Right, and that's the beautiful thing about capitalism in this situation, because these are publicly owned companies, and these companies are accountable to, who's the public? Is it Bill Gates? Is it Warren Buffett? Who owns more stock in this country than anybody else? Does somebody know? Who?
Trust.
What kind of trusts?
Education. Insurance.
Insurance owns a bunch, but but think about the largest owners. It's actually teachers. So you're right with education trusts. California Teachers Retirement System. Who's the second largest owner? Government employees. So you got these management teams that are accountable to teachers and government employees, every ordinary people. That's the beautiful thing about publicly traded companies. And when you exercise your power as a shareholder to go engage these management teams who are ultimately accountable to you, you can actually come up with ideas that can improve their brand and make them run more efficiently, which is what Andy does and Melissa does with leveraging your portfolio to bring about this change, but not owning a huge chunk of the risk by $5,000 or $10,000 as opposed to hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And more, like I mentioned with the stock buybacks, the companies are owning themselves.
Right.
So that's definitely a transition. The tool that we built, what we found, and this has to do with the Divest Invest Individual, which Vanessa spoke about yesterday. When you take that pledge, you're saying as an individual that you're going to be divesting from the Carbon Underground 200, the 100 largest coal and 100 largest oil and gas companies, by reserve. That's that list, and it's updated once a quarter. But most people own mutual funds and ETFs. Most people have a 401k, a 403b, and they can choose from a list of 20, 30 mutual funds. Do you know, how many people know what's in their mutual funds? I can tell you, I did not know. And this is how this started. Actually, it started with John Powers coming up to me, I guess 2 or 3 years ago and saying, hey, I signed that divestment pledge, I'm out of the Carbon Underground 200, but I still own Duke and Southern and all these coal-fired power plants and all these other companies, Tesoro, and what the heck? And I was like, geez, you're right, what do I own? And I went and it took me a while, it took me a couple of weeks to actually figure out what I owned because it's not apparent. It's not in the prospectus. The prospectus only shows you the top 10 holdings. But some of these companies, some of these mutual funds hold 600, 700, just all kinds of numbers of companies. So we build fossil-free funds. Every month we get an update from Morningstar, gives us the most recent holdings within every mutual fund, and we compare it to all these different lists. And you can define fossil-free however you like. It defaults to Carbon Underground 200, but you can choose, oh, show me all the utilities that I own. Show me all the smaller companies with reserves. Show me all the Halliburtons and Schlumbergers, all the pipeline companies and the field service organizations. Now you can kind of make a judgment call. And yesterday's South Pole Group did a presentation. We're going to be adding their data, so now you'll be able to see the aggregated carbon footprint of the mutual fund on a kilograms of carbon per dollar basis. So you could compare a $150 billion fund to a $10 billion fund, apples to apples. We're also going to be adding how these funds vote their proxies on climate issues. So all these different parameters will give a score to every mutual fund. And now you can start to decide, who do I want to own? And the number of funds actually increased from, when we launched it, there were 10 funds that were fully clean, 100% fossil free, and now there's 15. We expect that to go to 21 by next month, just because the fund managers call me and they say, what should I sell to get 5 badges? And we give them a list. And we're seeing that they're actually doing it because of demand. So it's, we're seeing this space is nascent, but it is evolving. And so we have 5 minutes. Should we take questions, or do you guys have any?
Sure.
Go ahead, we can take questions if you want.
If anyone has any.
Uh-oh,
Mr.
a tough
Powers.
one, Mr. Powers.
I'm looking for the time when people stop talking about, have you taken the pledge? But they ask people to stand up who have in fact divested. And I just remember Tom asking our board saying, so we have a 3 to 5 year plan for you all to divest. Do you remember the response you got from the board?
I think they said, let's do it now.
Yeah, we gave you 2 weeks.
Yeah, right.
Didn't work in 2 weeks, but we gave you 2 weeks.
Hi, I'm Gwetta. Really great that you're doing this. I love this. Can you just kind of estimate a range of, at the current rate that it's going, how long you think it's going to take for there to be like a critical mass on these shareholder? I mean, is it going to be 10 years? Is it going to be 5 to 10 years?
When you say
before
critical
we-
mass, I don't know if anybody could hear her. She asked how long.
Did you hear me? How many?
I did.
How many? What's the range? How long do you think, at the current rate, the projections are? How long is it going to take for us to reach critical mass on these shareholder influence over this? 10 years? I mean, how much?
Just to, so you understand how it works, these resolutions are non-binding. Even if you get a 99 or 100% vote, the company is not obligated to do it. Now, if you get a vote in the 30%, well, imagine that you had somebody, an owner, who owned 30% of your company, who asked you to make a change. Well, that's the kind of pressure that they're getting. They're also getting public pressure. When we asked Exxon to give us a report on carbon asset risk, and they published a report that said there is no carbon asset risk, nor will there ever be any stranded assets, that hit the front page of the New York Times business section, and that caused ripples. It ended up in 400 newspapers around the world that Exxon is not planning for a climate-constrained future. So it's not a matter of, these are non-binding. Now, in the UK, they are binding. And last year there was a 99% vote at Shell and a 98% vote at BP. But the resolutions were they weren't about making change. They were about doing some reporting. And as I say, after a 99% vote at Shell, literally 2 weeks later, they launched their oil platform to go up to the Arctic through all the kayaktivists, right, in Seattle Harbor. Came back about a month later and told shareholders, hey, we're going to have to write down $7 billion in losses because, yeah, you were right, it was a bad idea. You'd think with a 99% vote that like the spirit of it would affect them, but it didn't. So the question is which companies are going to actually look at their own preservation? I was on a call the other day just on Shell with the people who are managing the Shell pension fund, and they're terrified because they're so invested in fossil fuels. They were asking, how do we get out of fossil fuels in our pension fund because we're afraid we're not going to be able to make our payments? And the answer is, well, you shouldn't be so far invested in Shell because you got a lot of risk there, and then you're also in all this other stuff. But when you start hearing that, you realize things are shifting.
Yeah, I guess I should have said, because you're working with the pension funds, right? The 3 that he mentioned, or somebody's working with the pension funds. That's a lot of money. I mean,
Yes.
So if you factor them in, where do you see the point of?
Well,
critical-
Norges, the largest pension fund in the world, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world,
How long is this going to take?
they have divested
the
from
pension
coal.
funds to make a difference?
I would just weigh in that I think that it's going to take time, but it's time worth investing. And I think particularly, from a foundation's perspective that's actively making grants in this area, it's really about firing on all fronts. And so it's engaging with your proxy votes, it's divesting, it's investing in climate solutions, and really not giving up and participating actively and inspiring others to do the same, because that's the only way to make the change that I think everyone in this room wants to see.
And you guys have
Right.
been supporting litigation
Right, it's
on
a,
coal ash issues?
it's a tool.
From the administration. And so pumping up your game, if it's going to take too long to get the new president to call these pension fund managers in and try, you can pump it up, right? You'll hopefully by January you'll have a new force in, right? And
Well, so here's the thing. The shareholder action is a tool. Okay, it's used in conjunction with a lot of other work. 350.org, the students that we heard from, they were out with UC Regents. It's a tool to be used with grassroots activism to bring about that change. It's like, and that's how, foundations can use it, or use individuals to give money away. You do your shareholder engagement, but you have to have a community and a grassroots movement to kind of push that change to come about. The more aware management teams will make the shift immediately. They'll do it through a dialogue, okay? The fossil fuel companies have embedded risk. They need to make that change, so we need to be a little more creative. It's going to be a big push. There's going to be litigation, there's going to be shareholder resolutions, there's going to be grassroots activism, and there's going to be economic, technological shift. All of it's going to happen together, and that combined is what's going to make this change occur quicker.
And I know we're over, but just one last comment is there are pensioners who are organizing globally around the world. There's an organization that is literally, you can go online and you can do a pull down by your country and then your pension fund, and you can send an email to your pension fund managers telling them how to vote their proxies. And pensioners have never been organized in this way, but ultimately the teachers need to organize. Just anyone who owns a pension needs to be directing their managers how to vote and what kind of pressure, because they have huge, huge influence.